The rain's not going to stop, but we're not going to stop as well. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Christoph Winkler, endowed professor, founding program director of the Heinz Institute, and this is day 2 of our e-talks. For those of you who don't know, e-talks are really our way to bring in entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial individuals who really share their stories about, how they found their way into, entrepreneurship or into taking on particular opportunities and challenges and really creating businesses and solutions for that. And today we have the honor to have Matt Rizzetta with us. And I'll share with you a brief bio. When we first met the first time, I heard Matt's story, I was fascinated because I love sports, and I think many of us do. And just this business side of sports is something that when I grew up, really never thought about as something that, is happening, because you only see it pretty often as a fan. So it was fascinating to learn from that. And I think his story and how he kind of approaches this is really fascinating. So Matt, thank you for joining us today. Matt is also a member of our advisory council here at the Heinz Institute, and I think a newly appointed trustee to the Iona University Board of Trustees. So congratulations, and thank you for all that you do for the university. A little bit about Matt. Matt is the founder and managing partner of Underdog Global Partners, a firm that owns, operates, and advises sports, media, and entertainment assets worldwide. Entrepreneur and global executive with a track record of buying, operating, and scaling companies across multiple industries. Also the founder and CEO of North 6 Agency, which he ran from 2010 to 2020. Grew North 86 into one of the 50 most powerful firms in the United States. Since 2020, he built a diversified portfolio of sports, entertainment, and media holdings. Acquired Cambasso FC in 2022, that's in Italy, and led the club through major growth, including an exclusive partnership with Disney. Co-creator and executive producer of Running with the Wolves, an ESPN original series, which some of you may already have heard about, and also led global sports acquisitions, including Brooklyn FC, Donnarumma FC, formerly RES Roma, Napoli Basketball, expansion of the Canadian Premier League into Quebec, and Matt also serves as the president and board chair of various sports properties within his group portfolio, and he's also an author of 2 books and sits on the board of multiple organizations. And he takes time to come here and does everything else because you have a tremendous portfolio, super busy. So I really appreciate your time here, and I'm going to pass it on now to Noelle, who will lead you through the conversation. So thank you and welcome, everybody.
Thank you, Christoph. Thank you, Matt. It's so nice to meet you.
No, great to see you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I'll dive right in with our questions, and I'll also pause halfway through to see if you all have any questions for Matt. So my first question is, take us back to your time here at Iona, and what was your major, and when did you decide that ownership was right for you?
Well, first off, Noel, it's great to be here. It's great to be back at Iona. I see a lot of people in sports gear, Giants, Iona baseball. So hopefully this, the theme of today's discussion is exciting. I know it's an early morning lecture, but hopefully we can get you out of bed if sports can't get you out of bed, then nothing can. But it's a pleasure to be here. Iona for me it's funny because as I've progressed in my career, I think I've really understood the value of communities, and I try now in all of our different business activities to surround ourselves with investments where we really feel we can impact communities, and we can also be a part of a community, building a community, growing a community. And that's really what we do. Some of the assets that Christoph mentioned that we own and manage now across the world are all community-based. Naples, in Italy with the Amalfi Coast is a massive community, and we bought the basketball team out there. The Campobasso project was this little sleepy, team in the central part of Italy that no one had heard of, that we sort of resurrected and turned into a great Cinderella story. I don't know how many in this room are soccer fans, but we sort of did what Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney did with Wrexham in Italy. With Campobasso. And anyhow, the underlying theme of all of these investments was community. And we've really tried to put ourselves in a position where we can help the community, but more importantly, the community's actually given more back to us. We've gotten so much incredible gratification, not just in our business journey, but just in the way that we've become part of the communities. It's enriched our lives. It's brought our families together. It's created great friendships and networks. So I always think back to Iona, because Iona was really, I would say, the second community that I became enamored with. The first community, of course, was my family, the family unit. My mother's here, my wife's here, so it's great to have them here. But the Iona experience for me was all about community. You can go to any institution, any school in the country and get an education, but there's very few where you can really, I think, find yourself to be a part of a community that's as warm and as compassionate and willing to help, and represents the spirit of servant leadership the way that Iona does. So for me, it really set I didn't know it at the time, but it set the tone for the rest of my career, where we were going to go invest in community-oriented assets.
Right, right. And so what was your major here, and when did you realize like going into entrepreneurship and not working for somebody else was right for you?
Well, I majored in mass comm. I really, really fell in love with the concept of marketing. I thought marketing at the time was a cool concept. I liked the idea. I was always a creative person, and I liked the idea of being able to dedicate my life and my career to the creative services industry, but also to do it in a way that was a little bit more data driven and pragmatic. And I think that's what marketing does. Marketing is not just all creativity. There's also a real sort of scientific part to it as well. And, I always loved the idea of building things. And, I knew very early, back when a lot of it had to do with, I think, my family background. I came up, and as I mentioned, my mom's here. I came up not necessarily from a family of entrepreneurs, but I came up from a family of, people who had sacrificed for many generations. My grandparents were North 6 agencies named after North 6th Avenue, where my grandparents immigrated when they came from Italy. Just like so many people in this room, I'm sure can relate to. They were just hardworking people, made a lot of sacrifices, to give me the opportunities that they never had, as my mother did. My mother worked for 40, 50 years in the Mount Vernon school district, sweating in the school district in Mount Vernon. My father did the same thing. And I always felt a great responsibility to create something that maybe they didn't have an opportunity to create. And I think that's really what drove me to want to be an entrepreneur at an early age. I just felt like, not that a 9 to 5 is not a dignified job. Of course not. But I just always felt like I had a responsibility to give it a shot, to create something that maybe they didn't have a chance to create. And I decided that pretty early. Then when I got out of Iona, it all comes back to family again. When I got out of Iona, I needed a job. I wasn't, I had no business experience. I had no entrepreneurial experience. I wasn't ready to take the leap then. And of course, my mother, who, it's a funny story. My mother, one of her first or second years teaching school in Mount Vernon, on the south side of Mount Vernon, one of her early students was a woman named Dawn Short. And Dawn and my mother really became almost like a big sister. She's 22 years old or whatever she was, her first year teaching at the time. And then fast forward to 40 years later, when I get out of Iona, that same student, Dawn, became one of like the top executives at Sony BMG. I graduated from Iona. I needed a job. And my mom calls up Dawn and says, "Hey, my son needs a job."
Thank you, Mom.
And that's where I got started. I started in the marketing department at Sony BMG. I always knew I wanted to start a business of my own, so I worked my butt off. I worked a 9 to 5 at Sony BMG. This was in the days, probably, you guys are probably too young to remember it, but there was a show on MTV. No, you definitely remember it, TRL.
Oh, of course.
With Carson Daly.
Daly, yeah.
And I would fight my way through. It's where our office was. I'd fight my way through all the traffic and the tourists that were outside the studio. Work for Sony BMG from 9 to 5. I'd get on the commuter train as soon as the day was over. I'd come home. I was living with my parents at the time. I just graduated. They were living in Yonkers and Crestwood. And I'd work from like 6:30 p.m. to 3 a.m. to try to become a sports agent, to try to get players jobs overseas and stuff. And my real ambition at the time was to become a sports agent, and just to get enough clients where I could build a steady stream of revenue, quit my job at Sony, and then turn that into a job. It didn't work out the way, just like a lot of things in life, didn't work out the way that I had hoped. But then 3 or 4 years later, when I started my first business, N6A, a lot of those experiences really came in handy.
Wow, that's amazing. So would you say you're a risk taker?
Absolutely, yeah. I think you have to be in entrepreneurship.
Absolutely, yeah. The next question is, you built and scaled North 6 Agency. What mindset shift had to happen for you to move from running one company to then building Underdog Global Partners?
Well, no, what happened was, I mentioned after I stopped working at Sony a few years later, then I started N6A, North 6 Agency. That was the agency that I built as a marketing services business. We built it for about 10 years. We turned it into, as Christoph mentioned, we had a lot of great people around us. Thanks to them, we were able to achieve, I think, a lot of success that I frankly never in my wildest dreams would have imagined. We became one of the 50 top privately held marketing firms in the US. And then around COVID 2020 is when I divested and I sold some of my equity in North 6 Agency, and I started diversifying my portfolio. At the time I was in my late 30s. And I had just worked my butt off. I'd worked so hard. I mean, you never stop working. I had 3 kids, and I love my girls to death, Viviana, Valentina, and Simona, but it came at a incredible, it came at an incredible cost. I was constantly working. And then when I sold some equity in North 6 Agency after 10 years, I was like, you know what, I want to dedicate myself to something that I'm passionate about. And I was always passionate about sports. I love to work. That's the first thing is I love to work, and I don't feel like I'm working because I'm just, when you work in your passion, you never feel like you're working. Right. And I'm really blessed to do that. But I didn't want to stop working. But I wanted to work in something that I loved doing, and I loved sports. And I went in and I bought an interest in an Italian soccer team. That's the team Campobasso. It was the team where my grandparents actually immigrated from, about an hour and a half outside of where my grandparents immigrated from. And I just fell in love with the concept of sort of building this Cinderella story and putting this small team in Italy on the map. Nobody was really doing it at the time. Now, soccer ownership in Europe has become very mainstream, as you guys I'm sure know. But back then, this was 2020. We were really early in it. And now it's become UGP, Underdog Global Partners. It's become a professional portfolio with multiple assets across the world in all different types of sports. But it really just started because I wanted to do something I was passionate about. And I think there's probably a good message there to follow your passion and give it 110%. Don't be afraid to take some risks. Don't be afraid to make mistakes and learn from your mistakes, and it'll walk you to really good places.
That's amazing. When you evaluate an acquisition, what makes you believe you can create value where others haven't?
Well, I think when you look at sports and you talk about value, the first thing you have to do is you have to study the existing streams of revenue that the teams, in the case of sports franchises, that teams generally have. So, when you talk about sports franchises, there's generally 5 or 6 core streams of revenue: TV, merchandising, ticket sales, sponsorships, all sorts of different things with licensing. And so that's the first thing I think you do is you want to look at those, what's in front of you already. What does the team or the sports asset already have, and how can you optimize those revenue channels? And in the case of, the reason we're called Underdog Global Partners is because we tend to invest in underdog, undervalued type assets. So when you look across all of those revenue streams, usually they haven't reached their full potential. So that's the first thing we do is we look at what's in front of us in terms of the existing core revenue channels and how can we improve them. And then the second thing is how can we open up new streams of value, new streams of revenue? How can we create new opportunities? And like in the case of Campobasso, just as a quick example, this is a place in Italy where there's 300,000 people that live in this region in Italy. Okay. The region is like obsessed with the team. I mean, it's all like, today was say Thursday. I mean, they've been talking about, we got a game on Monday. It's all they've been talking about all week. We're going to play Monday, and then beginning first thing Tuesday morning, every cafe and bar. And that's all they talk about is the game the night before. But the one thing that we saw as an opportunity to create new value there was 1.2 million people from that region of Italy who lived in America, in New York and Philly and Montreal. And so we really felt there was an and they all wanted to be connected to the club, but the club really never had, because they just didn't have the network to do it because they were Italian, they were European owners. They didn't really engage with their American audience. So that's the first thing we did was we really wanted to create a platform for Campobasso as representing the underdog, being the underdog team for the Italian Americans who had immigrated from that part of Italy. And that's the first thing we did. And that enabled us to create all sorts of new value and revenue channels to this day. Like the sponsor of our stadium is actually a company that comes from Montreal. that was founded by someone from that area of Italy. I mean, we've created so many different new types of fan engagement initiatives that's really changed the trajectory of the club. But that's an example of something that we saw an opportunity to create new value that didn't exist previously.
And would you say it was difficult to bring this to America, or did you find it?
Well, yeah, everything's difficult. I mean, the thing about the sports investment, I tell people this all the time, Noel, like it's sports, so it's very, it's very sexy. I mean, everybody wants to be working in sports, and they should, because it's amazing. If you can get out of bed every day and you're passionate about what you do, whether it's sports or music or art or whatever it is, I really think it's a blessing. But sports in particular, I mean, everybody wants to work in sports.
Right.
So the first thing I tell college students who are looking to get into sports is, of course you want to get into sports, who doesn't? And the second thing is you have to realize that it's so competitive, that for every one new hire, there's, like 10,000 candidates out there, whereas some of the other industries that might not necessarily be the case. So you're talking about recruiting from a talent pool that is the cream of the cream of the cream of the crop. And you got to be prepared to put the work in. I own our business. I'm the majority, the principal owner. But I don't sit back and watch our games. I mean, I do watch our games, but I'm working 25 hours a day, 8 days a week, 366 days a year. You're literally working more than you ever thought you could work. So I think that's important. And I think anyone looking to go into that profession, they need to be realistic about it too, because they have to say, yes, I'm passionate about it. Yes, I'm willing to make a sacrifice, but are you really willing to make the sacrifice? Especially before, like now, I've been fortunate. We've built a great network around the world, contacts, investors, clubs that we own. But if you're just getting out of school, you don't have a network yet. So you have to go build your network. And in order to build that network, you're going to have to work even harder than you'd ever have to work. So I think that's something that anyone really needs to take into consideration.
And did your friends, did your family, did anybody say you're crazy for wanting to own a soccer club? What was your response?
Well, yeah, I mean, my friends and family have been telling me I'm crazy for 43 years now. But yeah, look, I think entrepreneurship, I mean, it defies logic in many ways in general. I mean, starting a business, it's funny, just as a story, forgetting about sports, when I started my agency business, N6A, there's the first thing somebody dropped a note off on my desk, like it was like a couple months into starting the business. And it was a statistic, and it was this small business survival statistic. And it was like 93% of all small businesses fail within 3 years. So I was like, okay, so I got a 7% chance of staying in business for 3 years. And then they sent me another statistic, and it said 96% fail within 10 years. So I said, all right, I have a 4% chance of staying in business for 10 years. And anyway, that motivated me. And I kept that statistic in my desk drawer. And I said, you know what? Not if, but when we make it to the 10-year mark, I'm actually going to write a book. Christoph mentioned I wrote 2 books. I'm actually going to write a book capturing the 100 lessons I learned in my first 10 years that helped me beat the odds. And I think, that, anyway, going back to your point about being crazy and risk, unfortunately, if you're going to look at statistics, entrepreneurship is probably not the path that you want to pursue, because all of the data is going to tell you you're crazy and you shouldn't do it. But, inside of you lives an incredible amount of belief and self-belief and conviction. And I think if you're going to be an entrepreneur, you do have to trust those principles, and you have to be prepared to overcome the odds.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great answer. I want to make this conversational too. So if anybody has any questions now they'd like to ask, I'll pause before I get to my next question. Anybody? Not yet? Okay. I will go to the next question then. So we'll get into the ESPN series. How important is storytelling when you're building a brand or increasing the value of an asset?
Well, when you look at sports, the cool thing about sports, Noel, in my opinion, is I think it's the best storytelling platform that exists. Everyone loves sports. And now in the days, I'm sure, Iona's done a great job of getting ahead of AI, I think, in general, and the latest in technology trends and innovation. But AI is threatening every single, it's in some cases it's helping, but it's also, no doubt, undoubtedly threatening some industries. So when you look at sports, it's really one of the last remaining forms of live entertainment that's unscripted. You still, you go to a Yankee game, you don't know who's going to win the game. You go to a Giants game, although if you go to a Giants game this year, you know they weren't going to win the game, but you should not know who's going to win the game. And it's really one of the last, remaining forms of unscripted entertainment. So I think that creates incredible opportunities for media and for storytelling in a way that no other industry really does. And if you're going into sports, you have to embrace that and you have to use that as a differentiator because it's something that your industry offers that no other industries don't. So in the case of Campobasso, that was the first thing I saw. People looked at me like you were crazy. Like when we bought the team, it was 10 days before the season started. And I don't know how many of you follow soccer in Europe, but they have promotion and relegation, right? So if you win your league, you go up. If you finish in the bottom, 2 or 3 spots, you go down. And the team had just been placed into the 5th tier, which is basically an amateur league. And we had 10 days to put everything together. We had no players. We had no coaches. We had a stadium that was literally abandoned by the old ownership. There were mushrooms growing off of the pitch in the stadium. And people, of course, they have to look at you like you're crazy to be doing this. Because not only do you have to put a team together, you got to put a team together then to win the league to go up. So of course, like they looked at us like we were crazy, but I looked at it like, yes, we're crazy, but there's also an incredible opportunity to tell a story here. Because who doesn't, that's the story of all of us in this room. That's the story of the underdog. That's the story of the people who immigrated here, right? That's the sort of the people who sacrificed. And then I was really fortunate to have met Mark Consuelos and Kelly Ripa, who become, family basically. And they fell in love with the story. They wanted to help. They said, how can we help? We love the story. And we want to go impact this community in Italy and put this story on the map in a global way. And then we wound up a few years later selling the media rights to Disney, and Disney produced the series Running with the Wolves, which actually we're hoping, gets renewed for a 2nd season very soon.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
That's great. All right. Any questions? Anyone have a question? Yes, go ahead.
I know a question. What was it like producing that show, Running with the Wolves?
What was it like producing Running with the Wolves? For me, it was, I think a lot of the things in your career, if I could give any advice, I think you always want to reinvent yourself in your career. I think it's one of the coolest things you could do. Like I started out, my first business was a marketing services business. And I loved it. I loved the business. And I'll answer your question too, just in a roundabout way. But then after 10 years of building that business, I felt like I was starting to be typecast a little bit, where people viewed me as, they were like, Matt Rizzetta is a really good marketing services entrepreneur. And I think most people would have accepted that and said, that's not a bad thing. There's worse things you could be. But I always felt like I could do more. I always felt like I had more to offer. And that's when I started to rethink sort of, and I like to do things in 10-year spurts. So in your career, I think you should look in 10 years. What are you going to do from the age of, let's say, 22 to 30, say, and then 30 to 40, and then 40 to 50. So I felt like I was ready to reinvent myself in a new way. And I kind of wanted to show people that I had more in me than just being a marketing services executive or entrepreneur. And that's when I started buying sports teams. And now, it's 6 years into buying sports teams. People know me more, as a sports owner and a sports operator than they do as a marketing services executive. And for me, that's a really cool thing because it shows that, I was able to sort of reinvent myself. And I think that that's a really beautiful thing. And I think all of you should look to do that. You never want to rest on your laurels. I could have just sat back and, made a great living and ran an amazing business for the next 20, 30, 40 years. But I really felt like I wanted to test myself to try new things out. So your question around the TV show, that was another thing I think to put in this reinvention bucket. It was a new experience for me, and it was so cool. I mean, to get behind the scenes and then in front of the camera and learn how a TV show gets produced, to have relationships now across the world with Disney and Disney executives was an amazing experience. And nobody could take that away from me. I see there's an Iona baseball, player here. If you win the baseball championship in the MAC, no one can ever take that away from you. That trophy is yours forever. Our basketball team is going down to Atlantic City to compete. And if we win 4 games in the next 6 days, 7 days or whatever, those players will have a trophy that nobody will ever be able to take away from them for the rest of their lives. And I felt the same thing. I really feel the same thing about your career. Like it's really not about the money. It's about what can you look back on with a source of, I think, sense of pride? And for me, producing the TV show is something that nobody can ever take away from me. And I'm really proud of that.
Yeah, that's great. Great question. Thank you. So for students in this room, how do you how would they train themselves to see opportunity instead of obstacles?
Well, I think the big thing with that, Noel, is just like in life, in entrepreneurship in particular, nothing is ever a straight line. It's actually something my father taught me, and my father was not an entrepreneur, but he taught me that. I mean, life does not go in a straight line. Anybody in this room, I'm sure, can attest to that. You're gonna get surprises. Most of them are not going to be pleasant surprises. The higher you get on the food chain in your career, nobody wants to deliver bad news to you. So you have to learn to, I think, become a little bit more adaptable, and you have to learn to figure out new and innovative ways to understand feedback, because feedback is the lifeblood of growth, and you can't improve if you're not getting honest feedback, right? So when you talk about how to turn obstacles into opportunities, I think you have to go out and experiment. You have to be very comfortable experimenting. One thing that we did way back when we started our agency, and I've been doing this since I was your age, when I just got out of school, I call it taking foul shots. I remember hearing a statistic about Kobe Bryant when he was playing in the NBA, and after practice was over every day, he would take 1,000 foul shots by himself. Just when somebody would pass him the ball, take a foul shot, get the ball in the basket, pass it back to him, take another foul shot, do 1,000 times. And the thinking was that over the course of from one day to the next, those 1,000 foul shots don't really impact your game. But if you do it every day in repetition, 5 days a week, 7 days a week, 300 days a year, whatever it is, in repetition, it will make a difference. So that's one thing I actually have applied to networking, where from the time I was 21, 22 years old, I would take what I call foul shots, where I would just find somebody who I was curious to meet. Could be someone I read about in a magazine article, on the internet, billboard, and I would actually just send them an email and just say, "Hey, Noel, I saw that you were featured in the Iona alumni newsletter. I'd love to, grab a coffee and just get to know you." And I did those 3 times a day to different people. And the thinking is that, 90% of the time they don't respond to you, right? But the one who responds to you, if you do it every day, 7 days a week, that's, 3 foul shots a day. It's 21 per week. That's 80, 90 per month, over the course of, it's like almost 1,000 a year. And the people that I've met from those, what I call foul shots, have really changed my life and changed my career. I've met people who have become clients, who have helped me sell businesses, helped me buy businesses, and just beyond just business, they've just, some have become my closest friends. So I think that that's the most poignant advice I could probably give in terms of how to turn obstacles into opportunities, is just don't be afraid to put yourself out there. Take chances. Don't be afraid to be rejected. Rejection is, unfortunately, it's a part of life, and it's a part of entrepreneurship, and you need to be prepared to embrace it. And I think the people who can stand in the face of rejection and embrace it and say, you know what, I'm going into this and I'm prepared for the worst case to happen, are the ones who are probably most likely to succeed.
Sure. So this is probably a good follow-up question. What's been the biggest financial or strategic risk you've taken, and how did you make that decision?
Well, it's funny. I mean, when I started N6A, I had nothing. I had a pregnant wife, Daniela. I had it's funny because this is another story I want to tell, but I literally had nothing, and no entrepreneurial experience. I had no business experience. We had no money. My wife at the time was working as a public school teacher in Brooklyn at PS 205, and she just had to go on maternity leave. So we had no income, and that was a big risk. But, she believed in me, and other people believed in me, and they said, you're going to figure it out. And, it's always very, I think it's a very motivating thing when somebody who's close to you believes in you, maybe even more than you believe in yourself, and I think that probably, looking back, was the biggest risk I ever took, but it was a risk that I can't ever imagine not taking, because it changed my life. In fact, it's a funny story, because when I started N6A, I mentioned my first, I have 3 daughters, but my first daughter was not even born yet. She was like, I think we were maybe 6 or 7 months pregnant. And Viviana, that's my oldest daughter. And so like that became a huge source of motivation for me. I'm not going to let this fail with my daughter being born. There's no way I'm going to let it fail. But now, 15 years later, my daughter's going to turn 16 next month. I just got back about a month and a half ago from a trip to Italy where we're working on potentially buying what would be the largest soccer transaction in the history of Europe. Okay. And do you know who came on the trip with me? My daughter Viviana. And I took her out of school for 2 days at Ursuline. She's like in love with Italy. And, she's like living like a VIP over there in the best hotels. And for me, that was a really cool thing, because this is somebody who 15 years ago, if I didn't take that risk, when she was born 15 years ago, these opportunities that my work has kind of created for me because of calculated risks and because of not being afraid to take chances, has put me in a position where we're able to do some really cool things. And the awesome thing about sports is it creates experiences. It brings, like I said, it brings communities together. It's brought my family closer together. That's a memory that I will never, ever forget, and you can't put a price on. And it's something that my work has enabled me to live.
Of course. We know what you're probably, as an entrepreneur, what your days are like. Like you said earlier, you're working, 24/7. What is a typical day like? What do you do? What time do you wake up in the morning? Take us through your day.
Well, I wake up very early. We have a lot of the assets that we own are in Europe. So with the time change, I wake up at 3:30, 4 a.m. in the morning.
Right.
And there's like a trillion messages. I've learned to stay off of social media. I'm still kind of trying to get better at that, but stay off social media if you go into sports. That's the first piece of advice I can give you, because usually the comments are not what you want to hear. But so I wake up very early, 3, 4 a.m. and I usually check in with my operating teams with the European assets. So each one of the teams that we own the assets that we own have their own operating teams, CEOs and chief marketing officers and people who run the sporting department. So I just check in with them. They usually give me a daily report on how things are checking out. If there's any emergencies, obviously they try to make sure I'm aware of the emergencies so that I could adjust them. And that usually lasts till about 8 or 9 a.m. And then my workday begins here, where it's a lot of meetings. We've been really lucky. Terrence Burke, who's here tonight, runs our investor relations program, which is in the process of we're really expanding it out a lot. But we have a lot of investors who have backed our projects, supported our projects. So a lot of it is meeting with them and talking to them about the latest and greatest deals that we're working on. Sponsors, the Disney show, I'm meeting constantly with producers and stuff like that. And then the cool part is there's games to be played. So usually, 5 or 6 times a week we have games, and, game days are sacred. So we try to shut the phones off then and just enjoy what the fruits of our labors bring us to.
That's nice. That's nice. So how many people do you have working for you in Italy, and how many do you have here in the U.S.?
Well, we have across all of the assets, the way that we're structured at UGP, Noel, we have UGP, Underdog Global Partners, which is the parent company up top. And we're actually pretty small up top. We have only about a dozen or so people up top. And that's where all of our consolidated functions are. So investor relations, finance, marketing, legal, stuff like that. But then we have subsidiaries that are owned by UGP, which is where the teams are, real estate assets, whatever they might be. And we have about 100, some odd people that are employed across all of those subsidiaries. And the way that we're structured, we have 3 subsidiaries all owned by UGP. We have one that holds all of our sports franchise equity. One that has real estate, so like stadiums, arenas, academies, stuff like that. We have a lot of infrastructure projects that we're working on that's held there. And then we have an advisory subsidiary, which is where we actually help other groups go out and buy teams or buy sports assets themselves. And that business unit lives in our advisory group.
That's great. All right. I will pause with my questions again. Does anybody here have a question? Yes, Aiden.
So, as somebody who's entering the sports marketing field, I've been told when I was in high school and sometimes while I was here, it's really not about what you know, it's about who you know. Now, somebody who's succeeded in that career path, how accurate would you say that is?
I think it's it's also what you know. If you know everybody but you don't know anything, then that's not a good thing. But I think if you know everybody and you know something, that's better than that's a better alternative. So I think networking is the lifeblood of any career. I think you need to be out there and network. If I were to encourage you guys to do anything, it's to go out and to play in traffic and not be afraid to meet new contacts. And those contacts are going to change your life, and don't do it for, I would say, don't do it for any sort of selfish reason. Don't do it for any self-serving reasons. Because what I found in my experience is the times when I've reached out to people without any real self-interest, just because I'm curious, like you have a really cool story. I want to learn about you. Let's just sit down. And those have been the most rewarding in the long term from a business standpoint. And they started just because they were genuine and they were authentic. And I, had a genuine curiosity for learning. And that's what I would say is, I believe, the most important thing. And the cool thing about sports is that everyone wants to be in sports for the most part. So it opens the doors to so many new relationships that other industries won't. Like as cool as selling, hummus, it might be, it's not going to lead you to meet that many cool people because it's, at the end of the day, it's hummus. Sports is not that way. Sports, everyone wants to be involved in sports. So you're going to be out there meeting all kinds of new people. And I think it's going to open doors to you in ways that you should really look to capitalize on.
Thank you. Great question. Yep. Yes, go for it.
Thank you. Just going back to when you first bought your first team, how did you manage to get all your players and coaches in 10 days or whatever it was?
Yeah, I don't even know now. That was back we did that in 2021. Well, we had the first move we made was we had to hire a sporting director, like a general manager, and then ultimately so we had to move very quickly. I flew out to Italy, and I think we interviewed must have been 15 sporting directors it was in a hotel in Rome. And I locked myself into the hotel for, 2 days straight. And we just did meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting. And the problem is we didn't really have time to run a formal process where we could properly vet them and whatever. So a lot of it just went back to your question earlier about networking. A lot of it just went to my gut and my instinct. And a lot of, I had built an agency business for the previous 10 years before that. So I felt like I really believed in my gut and my instinct when it came to hiring people and managing people. And I found one person and I said, you know what, I'm going to bet on this guy. And at the end of the day, just like anything in life, your career is really just betting on people. And we bet on him. And sure enough, then he scrapped a team together in I think 3 days. We had 17 players, and within 6 days we had 25. And we were playing our first game 4 days later. That season we went 28 wins, 2 losses. Came down to the last match day, and we needed to win the game. And we won 2-0, 2-0, and we got promoted. And it was an amazing, amazing story. And then the next season, then we got promoted. The next season, we had to do it all over again because now you go up a tier, and it's you can't keep the same players in the 5th tier as in the 4th tier. And everyone thought I was even crazier than they were saying, because as you go up in tiers, it gets more and more competitive, obviously. And we were 5 games into the next season now, and we were one of the favorites to get promoted. But we weren't the top team. We were probably a 4th or 5th team to get to be favored in terms of the odds. And after 5 games, we were 2 wins and 3 losses. And I just felt the season was getting away from us. One thing I felt like I was pretty good at was kind of identifying issues with culture. And I could just look in the locker room and tell there were cultural issues. So we fired the coach 5 games into the season, replaced him with a new coach. People thought it was crazy. It's like you're firing the coach after 5 matches. And then the new coach we brought in wound up getting rid of our 5 or 6 highest paid players. I was like, why are you getting rid of our highest paid players? Because they're cancers. That's what he said. And they're terrible for the locker room. And he got rid of them. And we wound up going on this magical run, and we wound up winning the league again that year, and we got promoted. And that turned out to be, out of all of the decisions I probably made, I made a lot of stupid decisions in my career, but that was probably talk about risk, that was one of the highest risk decisions I made, but came out to be one of the smartest ones we made.
Yeah. Well, great question. Yes, you had a question over there?
So I'm majoring in media and communications, and I specifically want to go into sports because it's my favorite. Being someone that works in the sports field, I know you usually have to be noticed. What is your first step or a piece of advice that you would give me to help me in that kind of difficult field?
Well, I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier to this gentleman. I think networking is the first thing I would encourage you to do. I think sports. The interesting thing about sports is now I don't know how closely you follow the business side of sports, but right now a lot of sports, back in the day, sports teams primarily were owned by, extremely wealthy people, right? And then that's kind of changed in the past 3 or 4 years. In fact, a lot of the people we deal with, private equity is becoming very, very prominent in sports, and private equity, which is institutional investments, are dominating the sports world. And now a lot of the sports leagues, the Major League Baseball has done this, and the NHL has done this. They're really opening themselves up to private equity investments in a way that they wouldn't do previously. So I would say try to understand the business side of it too. There's a whole, sports is very attractive because you're like, who doesn't love sports? Everybody loves sports, but there's also there's a business side of it too that is stressful. It's it's scientific, it's financial, and I would say try to understand that side as well, because if you understand that side, I think you can kind of understand any side, and there will always be a job for you if you want to, because there's a lot of people who understand sports, but there's very few people who understand sports business, and there's even fewer people who understand sports and sports business. So that's what I would try to focus on.
Thank you. Anybody else have a question? Sure.
What is your biggest lesson that you learned, and how did you pivot when you made certain mistakes?
The biggest lesson I learned, I think the biggest lesson I learned is probably people oriented. You have to bet on the right people. Like, the reality is, if you you could have a great business. You have a mediocre business and have a great person running it, and that person will make that mediocre business can make that mediocre business great. You can never have a great business and put a bad person in that role and make it a great business. It just will never work. So the first decision I think you have to make, and these are lessons that I've learned over the past 16 or 17 years, is you just have to bet on the right people. And, at this stage in my career, I'm really fortunate. I'm able to surround myself with a circle of people, it's a tight circle. It's people I trust, people that are loyal to us. And then obviously, we always insert a new dynamic and a new person every once in a while. But I have a very, very kind of set, trusted, core circle of contacts that I surround myself with. And I think those were the lessons that I learned along the way. Anytime I tried to put a bad person into a good position, it never worked out. And anytime I put a good person into a difficult position, they wound up leading us to good places. And even if the business outcome wasn't good when I had a good person, it still changed my life in a positive way. So, we became friends, or, we did business in other ventures or whatever. And I was like, all right, that's not a bad thing either. Life is not all about making money. Life is, I think the most valuable currency is people. And I think that's how you have to look at people. You're collecting currency. If, you're meeting a new person, that person is enriching your life. They're making your life richer because they're providing you with a currency that you didn't have previously.
I love that. Yes, another question?
Sorry about that. What was it like overcoming those obstacles that people say you couldn't do this, you couldn't do that? What was it like for you?
That's the best part of it all. I had a sign on my office way back when, and there were two parts of my office. There was one wall, our office was in Soho on Green Street. There was one wall I had that overlooked Green Street. And that was the bet on wall, bet on. And those were all the people who ever bet on me. So anytime, and I always felt like I owed something to them, because, Noelle made a bet on me, so I have to pay her back for betting on me. My wife, my family, my friends, anyone who bet on me, I have to pay them back. So I kept every kind of note, every message, anything that anyone ever sent to me that had some sort of vote of confidence that they made in me. And that became my bet on wall. And then your question, the other side of the office, which was not overlooking Green Street, it was just dark, that was my bet against wall. And those were all the people who bet against me. And there's been a lot of them too, who just said, look, it's impossible to do this. You can't do this. You're too young. You don't have the money. You don't have the skill set. And I collected every one of those messages too, and I put them on my bet against wall. And that's how I looked at my career. Was every day I would walk into the office, I would look first at who bet on me. And those were people I felt I had an obligation to repay. And then I looked on the other wall and I said, these are people who bet against me, and I have an obligation to kind of prove them wrong, and in a respectful, professional way, kind of stick my middle finger up at them. And That's what my career has been. And I think all of you should look at it too. You're going to have a lot of haters, and the more successful you become, the higher you go, jealousy, envy, all of that stuff is going to become more and more a part of your life and your career. And, you want to shut those people out of your life, but you don't want to forget about them either, because I think they can also, their criticism in many ways, or their lack of belief, can also breed a great sense of motivation within you. And I don't think anyone who says just forget about the haters, I don't know if that's true. I think you don't want to surround yourself with the haters, but I think you want to remember what they said, because there's a part of you that lives deep, deep inside of you, where you should remember their words, and it should motivate you to prove them wrong.
When you're
Okay. When you are looking at acquiring an asset, whether it be a sports team, how do you manage the statistics and probability of success versus your ambition and your gut feeling that it's going to work out?
It's a great question. I think you're getting to a really interesting point, which is that it can't always be gut and instinct. You do need a source of, you need a set of data behind it that you study. And I had a saying that data without discretion is destruction. And I believe that. I think data is incredibly important. I think you need to look at all kinds of data sets, and they have to help you make an informed decision. But usually at the end of the day, the final decision does live somewhere inside of you, and it does live in your gut and your instinct. But I think you can't it's not always a good idea just to go with your gut and just to, kind of throw all else, caution to the wind. I think you need to have some set of disciplined, rigorous data that's helping you guide the decision. But then at the end of the day, usually the data never tells you for certain if you should or shouldn't do something. It just helps guide your decision and your probability. Like you said, maybe because of the data you've studied, there's a 40% chance of this working out, or a 20% chance, or 70% chance, but you'll never get 100%. So the only way to get to 100%, you're never going to get there. The only way is that you have to trust your instinct and your gut. So I think that I would always use data as a way to guide your decisions, but at the end of the day, you got to look deep down inside and say, I can do it. When we did the Campobasso deal, if I looked at the data, that was one I didn't look at the data for, because if I did, that would have been insanity. But we probably had a less than 5% chance of success, if that. But we succeeded because we had a big vision, and we were passion. I think passion overcomes a lot. I think if you're very passionate about something, we've talked about the odds of succeeding in entrepreneurship as a small business owner. If you're passionate about something, I think you can overcome a lot of those odds too.
All right, so I will ask the last question, and that is, what is next for Matt Rizzetta?
Well, we're really excited about what we're building at UGP and Underdog Global Partners. We're investing and operating in these sports-related assets, not just teams, but real estate, stadiums, arenas, sports media, sports data, anything that has sports at its core. And I think so we're really excited about that. We own and operate these assets. I think the underlying theme is the underdog. We like to bet on the underdog. We like to bet on sports assets that might, for one reason or another, be undervalued, but with a little TLC and a little vision and a little innovation, we can really increase the value and bring them to life in a way that maybe they weren't able to do previously. So I'm excited about that. And look, on a very personal, level, I think if I'm really fortunate. I'm at a stage in my life and career where I love what I do, and I get out of bed every day, as early as it may be, and I don't feel like I'm working. And I think if you can go through your entire career saying that, you've done something right. I have 3 daughters at home, as I mentioned, and that's the advice I give all of them. My little one, Simona, she is in love with theater and the arts and stuff. And hey, if you can, it's hard. It's not easy. It's hard. You have to go into it knowing what kind of sacrifices you have to make. But if she can make her entire career, every day she gets out of bed, a journey to, or if she can surround herself with the arts and theater and things that make her happy, who cares about anything else? And you've lived a great life. And, my middle one, Valentina, she's got passion. My older one, the same. In fact, my older one is funny. When Viviana came with me to Italy, you talk about networking. We were sitting at a table, and these were with billionaire sports owners, speaking only in Italian, by the way. And my daughter understands Italian. She loves the Italian culture, but, she's not from Italy. So it could be intimidating. She's a 15-year-old girl. And the owner of the team said to her, he said, what do you want to do what do you want to study when you go to college? And she kind of didn't know how to, and she's 15 years old, what the heck does she know what she wants to do,
Right.
10 years from now. And so she said, she took like a deep breath and she said, I think I want to go into fashion. And you know what he did? He said, oh, okay. And he picked up his cell phone and he called the CEO of Louis Vuitton, who he's friends with, and he put her on the phone. And the Louis Vuitton CEO said, hey, do you want an internship? And that goes to the power of networking. So, I think there's a lot to be said about networking, and don't be afraid to say. And look, if you could work every day in your passion, you've really done something right in your life. And I come, look, my parents were amazing, inspirations for me. My father was not an entrepreneur. He went to work every day from 9 to 5, so he could provide for his family. And I also learned a lot of, that taught me at an early age that was not necessarily what I wanted to do. I didn't want to just check in and check out. And I really wanted to enrich myself and the people around me through my work. And I made a decision at a very early age to follow my passion and to create new types of realities, but to do it in a way that you got to go and open with your eyes wide open, because that comes with a lot of sacrifices too.
Well, thank you so much.
you,
This wraps up our e-talk. We appreciate you being
Excellent.
here.
Appreciate it. Thank you guys.
Thank you, Matt. And Christoph, do you have anything else you want to say? No?
Nothing. Thank you. This has been super inspiring. I always love listening to you. There's always a new nugget, and I'm sure our students will take a lot of energy with them wherever life will take them. But I know it will be driven by passion and purpose.
Thank you.
Hopefully, also lots of success. And so will be.
Thank you guys. Go Gales. And feel free to reach out if I could be helpful to any of you guys in any way. Okay. Thanks.